Hello and welcome to Pods Above Replacement, part of the Padres Hot Tub Podcast Network. My name is Raphie Cantor. I am the producer of Padres Hot Tub, and joining me from the Mile High City, you can call him Professor. It's John Precoda.
Let's see if I can put on my reading glasses, grab out my calculator. I'm ready to go. TI-84 plus.
Wow, the high quality stuff right there. Big computing power. Just got some terrible flashbacks to AP Calc. All right, well, this is our way of showing you, in the only way we know how to, that we are going to be tackling a much requested topic, a little bit different content from the Par Boys coming at you this week. We're going to do a new series that we're tentatively calling Summer School, and basically just doing a breakdown of some of the most important and referenced stats that you will come across not only on our show, but in the modern kind of analytical side of baseball. So we're going to start with WAR, which is not only the most referenced stat, I would say the most complete stat that we have in baseball. And then we'll kind of go a little bit more granular from there. So before we jump into WAR, John, one question for you. What is it good for?
What is it good for? It might be good for arbitration numbers going forward. It sounds like F-WAR in particular, there's been some argument that can, judge how much a player is worth and tell players on the open market how much they're going to make, in which case I could see players trying to take advantage of these exact numbers as best they can.
Yeah, and I mean, there was talk in the CBA of using WAR to determine, rookie of the year bonuses and, allocation of funds and draft picks and like all this stuff. So a very, very important stat that we are going to dive into right now. So in order to think about WAR, we have to step back and talk about baseball in the simplest terms, right? The goal of the game is to win, and you win the game by scoring runs, and you cannot score runs when you get out. There are only 162 games that you can win in a given season, and each game has only 27 outs that you can commit. But you can score an infinite number of runs, theoretically. Okay? Certainly not if you're the Padres this year. But you can score an infinite amount of runs, theoretically. So, in baseball, there are two major scarce resources. There are wins, of which there are only 162, and there are outs, of which there are only 27 in a game. So, the opposite of getting out is getting on base. And I bring this up because this is the fundamental idea that drove Moneyball and the on-base percentage revolution. There were people who were obsessed for years about using batting average, but batting average doesn't tell the whole picture. It doesn't give you walks. Juan Soto would not be a batting average darling in the olden days, and today he is widely considered one of baseball's preeminent players. There's a reason for that. And so when the A's and a few other teams jumped on this in the late 90s and early 2000s, it really changed the way that we think about baseball. And so WAR is baseball's sabermetric's best guess at trying to create a single stat which encompasses every aspect of a player's game and measure their contribution towards wins, which is that other finite resource. So, there are hundreds of players that Major League Baseball organizations could bring up from AAA to play right field. But there's only one Fernando Tatis Jr., right? So the idea behind WAR is just how valuable is Fernando Tatis Jr. over those potentially hundreds of players that could come up to be playing right field. Those hundreds of AAA players are what baseball has dubbed replacement level, I think for reasons that are sort of intuitive. They can come in and replace anyone, and they're very cheap. These are players that you could get on the open market with a minor league free agent signing that would not cost your team a lot of money. And I think it's a really important to start from understanding WAR is that why we're using replacement level as a benchmark instead of league average. So, there's tons of stats that we are going to be referencing later on. We're going to be talking about WRC plus. Any stat that has a plus or a minus at the end of it is something that's normalized for league average. So WRC plus is the one that we talk about a lot. There's, ERA minus, FIP minus, anything like that. Those are stats that have normalized so that 100 is the league average. Throw that out the window for now. We're not going to think about that. But just, there's lots of stats that reference league average. But the thing is that league average is actually super valuable. It's actually super valuable to be a league average player, especially if you're healthy and you can play an entire season. So the term replacement level is the idea is like, what if we made a team that's entirely made up of replacement level players? How well would that team perform? And there was actually a lot of debate about this early on because there are two types of WAR, which we'll talk about later. There's Fangraphs, which is the WAR that we use on this podcast. And then there's another website called Baseball Reference, which has its own version of WAR. Both are totally acceptable for different reasons. We happen to prefer Fangraphs WAR on this website, or on this podcast. And in 2013, they had something of like a diplomatic agreement that was signed between the two of them, where they basically said, we need to have a standard for what replacement level is. And what they came to conclude is that replacement level was a team that would win about 47 or 48 games, somewhere in that range. So if you made up a team of 9 position players and pitchers and everything that were all replacement level players, they would theoretically, in our scientific version of baseball, win somewhere between 47 and 48 games. And that obviously is bad. There have been some teams that have tried to accomplish that for sort of nefarious reasons. I think you can look at the Oakland A's of this year and a team that's currently 9-31, I think, and see what a kind of team that's mostly playing at replacement level looks like. And so we want to use that as our benchmark, not league average, because a team that is made up, of 8 position players that are playing at league average and 5 starters that are playing at league average, those players alone could theoretically generate about 74 wins. You add in some, role players on the bench and some relievers and stuff that are playing at a league average level, and you're getting really close to 81 wins. So that's not, and by the way, that's not too far from a playoff team. And depending on the environment in certain years, that could be a playoff team if the league is super crappy. So before we jump into just how WAR is calculated, John, is there anything you wanted to add to kind of contextualize all of this?
So we're going to get into it. It's going to seem overwhelming, I think, to some folks, but in reality, it ends up being pretty simple, right? It's how much value do you provide over somebody that you could just call up? Because, you could get somebody off waivers, you could get somebody off AAA that's going to give you a certain amount of value. But how much more valuable is X player than that person? And we're basically just going to break it down into what it is. There's only a certain ways that you can be valuable. You can be valuable at the plate. You can be valuable on the bases. You can be valuable when you're out there defending, right? And so that's what we're going to get into.
Yeah. So with all that being said, if you're watching on YouTube, which we hope you are, right now we're going to throw up what the formula that Fangraphs uses for calculating WAR is. And as you can see, I'm just going to read it out for the folks who are listening. WAR is equal to batting runs plus base running runs plus fielding runs plus positional adjustment plus league adjustment plus replacement runs, all divided by runs per win. Okay? Everyone breathe. It sounds super dry. Some of you are asleep right now. And I'm going to try and wake you up, but that is the, initial demystification of WAR, if you've been wondering like just what goes into this. And so let's kind of break that down into steps. So the first step is figure out how valuable a given player is relative to league average in batting, base running, and fielding, and then add all that up. Okay? So that's, basically are they above or below league average in these 3 aspects of the game. All right. The next step is to adjust for which position they play. And this is really simple. It's really hard to play shortstop. It's really hard to play catcher. It's pretty hard to play center field. It's not that hard to play first base. And it's kind of hard to play second and third base. And ultimately, it's not hard at all to be a DH because you don't have to go in the field at all. So we want to recognize that if a player is hitting 300 and has a 350 on base percentage and is slugging 500 and they're playing shortstop, that is just generally more impressive and more valuable than if they're putting up those numbers and playing first base, because shortstops generally aren't as valuable and aren't as productive offensively. So you want to reward people if they're playing at that level from a premium position. The next step is to adjust for if they're playing in the AL and the NL. Now, this is going to become much less important, especially this year, because this is the first year where there's all this interleague play, where there's these balanced schedules and all the teams are playing. Before interleague play started in the late 90s, these two leagues existed completely in a vacuum from each other. And sometimes the run environment would be different. For a very long time, the NL did not have a DH while the AL did. So then the AL offense was higher, and then you have to adjust for that. And so everything that you're seeing in these formulas is to basically try and evaluate players on an even as a playing field as possible. So that goes into all of this stuff. The final step of addition is to add in replacement level runs. And like we were saying earlier, runs are the currency in baseball. And because we're calculating what the value of someone is above replacement, you have to kind of neutralize what replacement level is to determine what's above it. So a replacement level player is going to score runs, so you have to figure out what that replacement level is, going to contribute on an average basis, and then add that into the calculation so that you're essentially neutralizing for that effect. And then the final step is to divide all of that by runs per win. And runs per win is a number that's calculated every year. You can go on Fangraphs, you can go on Baseball Reference. They have it for you. You don't have to do the math. But basically, it just estimates okay, based on the offensive environment, and total innings pitched and what the levels were like in a given year, this is how many runs on average it took to win a game. And that goes on to, influence stuff like Pythagorean win-loss percentage, other more, again, specific stats. But that's the general basis, okay? Find out if a player is above or below league average, adjust for where they play and what league they play in, add in replacement level production, since that's the baseline, and then finish it off by determining how many runs it took to win a game in a given year, and then divide it all by that. Okay? So that's conceptually, and I'm going to pass it off to John, and he's going to talk a little bit about what this looks like in practice.
Yeah, so we've said it a few times, but it is important. An average major league player is not a replacement level player. And so there's difference there. A replacement level player is somebody that you could get off your AAA team or off waivers, whereas a major league average player is better, right? They're a major league player. They got that qualification as a major league player because they're good. And so a solid starter, somebody who, major league average player, who a team made up of these will get you a good 81 season or so, is going to give you about 2, maybe 3 WAR depending on the given year. And that's obviously not 0, right? And so that kind of contextualizes it a little bit. It's if you have a good player or a decent player and they're putting up 2 WAR, that's valuable for a team. And then so what makes a player, good or great or superstar, right? And basically you can just add a WAR to it and that'll put you into the next standard deviation. So it'll be like solid starter, 2 to 3 WAR. And then you want a good player, somebody who's not average but is providing more value to your team, add another WAR. That's 3 to 4 WAR. You want closer to an all-star level player, that's 4 to 5 WAR. And then you want superstar / MVP, now you're up in the 6 WAR grouping. And so all the math behind this sounds a little bit complex, but we're gonna throw up on the screen just a quick calculation using Manny Machado last year and show that it's really not super complex. Manny Machado, between his offense and base running value, was able to put up about 42 runs above average last year. Obviously, he had a really great year at the plate. And so since last year, runs were worth about or it was about 9.5 runs per win. You can say, he was over 4 wins more valuable than an average player at the plate last year, which is obviously very good. And if you include his defense and his position value, that gets you another about a WAR, which puts him up over that 6 mark. And then you put in just what like Alexi Amarista would do in a given year and how many runs he would create, add that to his total, and suddenly he's a 7.4 F-WAR player. And so that's really it. It's just how good were they at the plate, how good were they on the bases, and then how good were they at defense, and how important was their position. And then compare that to, say, Alexi Amarista, who's normally like a 0 WAR player, and that'll give you your total value. And then, so just so we have like an idea of how these things scale versus one another, I also did one for Jake Cronenworth, where Jake Cronenworth was worth about 30 fewer runs at the plate and on the bases than Manny Machado was, which just by itself, just while they were up at the plate, Manny Machado generated about 3 more F-WAR than Jake Cronenworth. But you include the fact that they had similar defensive value and Jake Cronenworth played more games overall, and you get very close to that 3 offensive WAR difference being the difference between their total WAR overall, which was Manny Machado 7.4 and Jake Cronenworth 4.1. So essentially they provided a similar amount of value, both positionally, defensively, and just how many at-bats they got because they had a similar amount of plate appearances. But Manny Machado was better at the plate, created nearly 30 more runs, and therefore had about 3 more WAR that he generated over the course of the year. And like I said, a solid starter will be worth around 2 to 3 WAR. So Jake Cronenworth at that 4 WAR range was more of a good player to all-star, and he was an all-star just barely. So that kind of explains why he was kind of in that all-star range, and the last couple of years has been kind of in that all-star range, and he's made the all-star game. So just one more thing to put on this real quick. You can remember this if you want or not remember this if you don't want, but it is, I think, important to say that Fangraphs thinks that per 1.0 WAR that you provide, you are providing around, in current environments, around $8 million in free agent value. And so if you're putting up 7.4 WAR like Manny Machado did last year, Fangraphs thinks that's worth nearly $60 million to your team overall.
Yeah, so just when we're talking about, if a player is playing up to their contract or playing, exceeding their contract in terms of value or not, living up to their contract, we're kind of generally talking, at least on this podcast, that's what we're talking about. We're saying, okay, you provided 2 WAR, and that's worth about $16 million in value, but your contract is $20 million a year, so you kind of played underneath your contract's value. So that's generally what we're talking about there. Moving on to pitching WAR. Pitching WAR uses the same principles as position player WAR, but obviously with different stats because we're not calculating offensive value. But basically you're saying, okay, how good is this player against average? Divided by how many runs per win, and then you add in the replacement level multipliers, and then for pitching, you also adjust based on if they're a starter or a reliever. And I'll go more into the sort of specifics on that, but we also need to start to talk about these 2 different types of WAR that I brought up earlier. F WAR and B WAR. That's the shortened terms for Fangraphs WAR and Baseball Reference WAR. And the reason I bring it up on pitcher WAR is because that's where I feel that the differences can start to be most pronounced, and it's because the methodology behind both is fundamentally different. And this includes for position player WAR too. I just think in batting WAR or in pitching WAR it's more on its face. So F WAR, which we use on this podcast, uses FIP, which is fielding independent pitching, to calculate the bulk of its value. Whereas B WAR uses ERA, earned run average, a stat that if you're listening to this podcast, you almost undoubtedly already know what that stat is. And this points to a philosophical difference between F WAR and B WAR. F WAR, generally, in my opinion, points to it values quality. It values the quality of your play. It values the quality of your contact, of your pitching, etc. Whereas B-WAR values outcomes. Okay, it's just how well did you do. It doesn't matter how you did it, just how well did you do. So FIP, which we'll try and just loosely break down. FIP is a stat that every year is normalized so that the league-wide FIP is equal to the league-wide ERA, but FIP doesn't account for any balls that actually go into play. It just accounts for home runs, walks, and strikeouts. And the reason that that's valuable is that defense is not something that pitchers can control. The defense on one team can drastically vary between another team, and you don't want to penalize pitchers who play on a team that has poor defense, and it also is not helpful when you're trying to compare between the two. So that's what the goal of FIP is. It's to essentially try and evaluate pitchers in a vacuum. And Fangraphs tends to like that. They think that that's cool. And B-WAR says, well, no. All that we want to calculate is what actually happened. And what actually happened is this player put up X ERA. And so because of that, we want to value or, reward or punish them for that. Sorry, go ahead.
Just one minute difference is that it's actually not ERA, it's total runs allowed. So
yes.
Unearned runs count as well.
Yes.
For B-WAR.
Sorry. Thank you for correcting me on that. So it's runs allowed per 9. So those are the major differences between Fangraphs and Baseball Reference WAR when it comes to pitching. So in Fangraphs WAR, it's we're taking the FIP. How do they do against league average FIP? And then we have to divide by pitcher specific runs per win, which is one of those things where when I go into it, I'm like, okay, my eyes are starting to roll back in the back of my head. But basically, the idea is that pitchers have a much larger control over the outcome of a game and the offensive environment in that game than batters do. So we have to basically create a runs per win specific to each pitcher, which, again, is one of those things that sounds complicated and takes a lot of data, but in practice is sort of simple. It's just like, how much do they pitch in a given game versus the league average, and what is their quality performance in that. You added the replacement level, you adjust for how often that they pitch, and then basically relievers get what's called a leverage multiplier, which the idea behind that is, okay, yes, they're pitching fewer innings, but they're typically pitching in more important innings, and so we should reward that. Josh Hader tends to have a very high WAR, where if you look at the amount of innings he's thrown on a rate basis, it kind of doesn't make sense. Well, it's because he has this leverage multiplier that essentially says that they value his contribution to the team more than the standard, fourth or fifth starter in your rotation, because he's pitching in the ninth inning with the game on the line almost every time he comes into the game. Before we move on to talking about defense, is there anything you want to throw in there, John?
No, I think you did a great job on that one.
Oh, thank you. So I'm always just searching for your approval. So this is exactly what
you get it. You always get it.
This is exactly what I needed. So the last thing we want to talk about, like we said, difference between F-WAR and B-WAR in pitching. It's FIP versus runs allowed in B-WAR. And in position WAR, when we're talking about defense, this is another place where you're going to see a huge difference between the two wars. And that is because F-WAR uses outs above average, which is new. This is in the last year that they made this switch, which is a StatCast statistic that we will break down in a later episode. And Baseball Reference WAR uses defensive run saved, or DRS, to calculate their defensive part of WAR. And the way I would break down those two things is that outs above average tends to favor more toolsy type players who make low percentage conversion. So think about, Trent Grisham, that we've long talked about his defensive prowess, him making catches that only 10% of people make that catch. Well, outs above average rewards you for that in a really meaningful way. Whereas defensive runs saved, it's more of a cumulative stat that tends to favor long haul consistency. So Ha-Sung Kim is like a defensive run save darling.
Okay.
And he, because he's someone who's always very healthy, and he's someone who does not make a lot of errors. And that's something that defensive runs saved is going to reward. And John, I don't know if you want to point out just how kind of crazy the differences are between DRS and outs above average.
Yeah, I mean, we were discussing WAR earlier, and I was saying that it's relatively simple because in reality it is. Each of the components are relatively simple. It's just like mostly your batting value, your base running value, and your defensive value. But two of those things are much easier to evaluate and much more consistent across platforms, and those are the base running value and the at-bat value, because you can hit a home run and you can calculate how much that was worth in a given year, that individual home run. But defense can vary wildly between these platforms. So one of the reasons why we pick FWAR overall in our preference is because of our preference of outs above average over defensive runs saved. And like you said, Ha-Seong Kim is a defensive run save darling, and he was last year, to the extent that his defensive value was so much that overall his value at shortstop, two players that both played shortstop last year, one was worth more than the other. Ha-Seong Kim was worth more than Trey Turner overall last year, almost exclusively because of his defensive runs saved, which, I mean, I think that anybody who's watched baseball can tell you that Trey Turner is the better hitter, and we could do all the stats in the world, but they're all going to say that Trey Turner is the better hitter. But despite his speed and, relatively okay arm, his defensive runs save are low, much lower than his outs above average are relatively. So in FWAR, Trey Turner far outpaces Ha-Seong Kim in terms of value. But for BWAR, for Baseball Reference WAR, Ha-Seong Kim was actually more valuable than, $300 million man Trey Turner last year.
Yeah, just to put numbers on it, in FWAR last year, Trey Turner had 6.3 FWAR and Ha-Seong Kim had 3.7. And in BWAR, Ha-Seong Kim was actually more valuable, even though on Fangraphs they would say that Ha-Seong Kim was almost half as valuable as Trey Turner. So that gives you the sense of like where these huge differences come from. And yeah, John, you pulled this stat, so I have to give you credit for this. But last year, the Padres were 19th in DRS in 2022 and 3rd in outs above average. And these are two stats that are purportedly trying to accomplish the same thing, you know what I mean? Which is just to value defensive contribution. And I think it points to a couple things. It points to how defense is kind of the final frontier of sabermetrics, in my opinion, like where it's like there's a lot of fine tuning that needs to be done to try and get it to a place where we can be reliably consistent. And it also personally for me points to why I prefer FWAR over BWAR, because I would rather get the quality of play over the outcomes, because baseball is an inherently fluky game and weird stuff happens all the time. And I don't think that because something weird happens, a team should necessarily be rewarded for it when we're doing like an analytical breakdown. Now, we've talked about this in terms of like awards and stuff like that. Like, I think when you're talking about who's the best player in a given year, there might be some value to looking at BWAR and saying, okay, like what were the outcomes of this year if we want to evaluate Cy Young candidates against each other, as we did in the Blake Snell episode recently. But if we're trying to look at value over time, especially value across eras, I tend to prefer FWAR, and I think I could speak for you, John, in saying that as well, as this is an FWAR podcast.
Yeah, I mean, especially for me on the position player side, I could see the argument on the this is a results-based business for the pitching side, because you can, with FWAR, kind of hand wave really, really great seasons based on outcomes with FWAR compared to BWAR for pitching. But with position playing, DRS is just so wonky as a statistic to me. I don't think that anybody's eye test would suggest that Ha-Seong Kim should make more than Trey Turner on an open market, and he won't. So, I mean, how much value are you putting towards the thing that nobody actually is, paying players for?
Yeah. So, just to recap, so we can kind of put a bow on this and really nail this in. WAR is calculated by figuring out how good someone is against average, adjusting for where they play, adjusting for which league they play in, adding in the replacement level, and then dividing all of that by runs per win. That's all you need to remember if you take anything away from this. And the other thing you need to remember is that a solid starter is worth 2 to 3 WAR over a full season. Anything below that, they're not that great. They're below average. Anything above that, they're good to very good to all-star to MVP caliber. Okay? And the last thing that I want to hammer in for folks is that WAR is a cumulative stat. The more you play, the more you generate WAR, the more time you have to generate value like that. So that's why, if there's a role player who only has, 200 to 300 plate appearances in a given year, they're not going to be able to put up, 4, 5, 6 WAR because they don't have the opportunity to do so. So you have to keep all this in mind when you're evaluating someone like, let's say, Lamont Way Jr. on the 2021 Giants, who only had 300 plate appearances but put up nearly 2 WAR in those plate appearances. He was still playing at like near an all-star level. He just didn't have the opportunity to play it because if you were to, again, prorate that over a full season, he's actually playing towards that 4 WAR mark. So, again, how they do above average, add in the replacement level, add in league adjustments, divided by runs per win, and you're golden.
Yeah, or you could just do what I do, which is basically just think about a round 2 as average and then slowly increase your descriptor as you add a WAR. So it'll be like average at 2 WAR, above average at 3 WAR, good at 4 WAR, very good at 5, and great at 6, and that'll basically tell you what you need to know. And then you can do the same thing in reverse where you're like 2 is average, 1 is below average, 0 is bad, and then -1 is just really, really bad.
All right. Well, this was our first episode of Summer School. I hope, dear God, I hope that this that this was helpful to you. If it was, please let us know in the comments. Like, comment, subscribe to our channel. It's going to help other people find the show. And if you want more of this, please let us know. If there's a stat that you have been itching to learn more about, this is a series that we could potentially do for a few episodes on, or we could be doing a very long run on, or it can be something that we pepper in every few weeks just to kind of, help things out. So please give us some feedback. We're itching for it. And with that in mind, John, anything you want to add before we put the kibosh on this?
WAR, what is it good for? Free agent prices, maybe.
Our value. Absolutely everything, John. And that's what we tried to calculate today. And that's what we hope you take away from this episode of Pods Above Replacement. We will see you next time.